in other species that do this, when the weaning stops, the brain growth stops, and the ketogenesis stops. In humans, brain growth continues and ketogenesis continues insofar as children get into ketosis way more easily than adults do. Up to adulthood, it's basically an inverse relationship between ability to get into ketosis and age. And the tracking between brain growth and brain size and ketogenesis is so compelling that I almost want to call a ketogenic diet a brain growth mimicking diet. Another, all right, next slide. I apologize, I meant to attribute this to Clark and Kubrick, and if you don't get the joke, I'm sorry. Even adults, though, are very, very easy to get into ketosis compared to other species. We have this unique ability to be completely calorie sufficient and completely protein sufficient, and as long as we're restricting carbs, we're going to be in ketosis. I don't know any other species that does this to the extent that we do. Rodents come the closest that I know of. So Dr. Finney's group was able to get mice ketogenic at some kind of ad libitum diet that was mixed, very high in fat. But he told me that the line between adequate protein and too much protein for ketogenesis is vanishingly small. Similarly, I spoke with Ben Beekman, who was working with rats, and he said it took his group a very long time to get the rats to be ketogenic without restricting calories. It was very frustrating. When they finally had accomplished that, it was a 90% fat diet, and then we have to start talking about definitions of ketosis, because the level that those rats were getting, I may misquote, but I think he said it was a quarter more than the control group, whereas in humans it's tens of times. The difference is really extraordinary. You might think that carnivores would be ketogenic because they don't eat any carbs, but in fact that's not true at all. As long as there's adequate protein, they don't go into ketogenesis. They don't do that until there is inadequate protein. I would love to see studies in other great apes. I was unable to find any. If you know of any, please let me know. My suspicion, my hypothesis would be that they would not have the ability that we have just because of that relationship to brain size. Our brains are about 3 times the size relatively to other primates, to other great apes. And another data point that makes us special is our fat level. Other great apes, a lean human has about 3 times the amount of body fat that you would expect on a primate, given our other relatives. And Stephen Cunnane and others have proposed that the reason for that is to be able to supply ketones for the brain. This is really a special ability. And I think that if we were making this adaptation, or in order to provide energy to the brain, then, and we made it to such an extent that we could have full calories and full protein, I can see that yes, the more protein you eat, the more ketogenesis is going to go down. But I don't think these studies have been done under full calorie sufficient conditions to compare different levels of proteins, but anecdotes suggest that the tolerance, the margin that we have for that is, for many people, you could eat 1.5 to 2.5 times your minimal protein needs and still be in mild ketosis. So we are able to do that, and that means we are able to be ketogenic without threatening our survival and with during periods of intense growth. So the idea that being ketogenic in a human is disruptive of hormones in the same way that starvation would be seems like it might be misguided. If you view ketosis as a clever hack that can be used to treat certain diseases, but that it's not sustainable because it's basically emulating a starvation mechanism, then you're going to have a very different interpretation of the observations that you see than if you believe that ketogenesis is something we evolved to support our brains and to support our reproduction. If you aren't really convinced that a low-carb diet is good for health, then as soon as you notice something unusual, you're going to worry that something's wrong with the diet. This is Goodhart's law. His idea is that if you have a measurement that is a loose proxy for something that you really care about, but that measurement's way easier to measure and quantify, and then as a society or a group, you start targeting the measurement instead of the thing that you really care about, then that correspondence begins to break down. So examples of this might be standardized tests where it originally was designed to measure some sort of competence, but then the teachers start teaching to the test and the correlation breaks down. Or you might say that using statins to address LDL are not going to have a big effect on heart disease because the correspondence between LDL and heart disease is not ever really causal in the first place, and so it's not going to have an effect. The kind of worst perverse example or paradigm that I see as a kind of reverse view of Goodhart's law is medicine that's addressing symptoms and not causes. So if an athlete is injured and you give her a painkiller and send her back out on the field, the absence of pain is no longer a good indicator that she's safe. What we really want with symptoms is to discover what the underlying cause is so we can address that. But that's a really hard thing to do. The diagnosis is an art, in part because we don't know what causes everything. And sometimes there are multiple things that can cause a set of symptoms. So at that stage, one way that we cope with that is to take measurements of different biomarkers that might have correspondences to sets of symptoms that might help us distinguish what the causes are. So here's an example of a set of symptoms, and there are many causes for these symptoms, and when they come together in a cluster, they're very often associated with hypothyroid. But hypothyroid itself has many different causes because there's so many inputs to the system. It's part of your metabolism. So if you present these symptoms, the next step would be to get a panel of biomarkers like this and see which pattern it might correlate to. Here's a pattern that you don't normally see on a high-carb diet, but it's routinely seen on a low-carb diet. And when it's in a low-carb diet, it's asymptomatic. And usually, generally, the lower the carbohydrate, the lower the T3. But the only thing that's really abnormal about this pattern is that the T3 is lower than the reference range that was established on a high-carb diet. But why would you expect a metabolic parameter that is at one level when you're making ATP in one way to be the same as it would be when you're making ATP in another way? The same argument can be made for vitamins. Vitamins are basically enzymes that are required in metabolic pathways. And if you're comparing the enzymes that you need to metabolize glucose in the cell versus ketones and fat, you should expect very different reference ranges. And I would submit that most of our RDAs are completely useless once you're talking about a ketogenic diet. And I would say the same thing for T3. This pattern has been studied before because it does occur sometimes in high-carb diets. And when it occurs there, it's because of either a critical illness like sepsis or in protein or calorie restriction. And if you wanted to know if this was a side effect that's damaging versus a helpful adaptation, one way you could distinguish that is if you supplemented with T3. Unfortunately, when they've done this in critical illness, the results are mixed and we still can't tell. But when you do it with calorie or protein restriction, the difference is that if you supplement T3, you will lose lean muscle mass. And so it seems that the function of T3 here is to preserve lean muscle, so you don't end up with a situation like this, where you have a low-calorie, high-carb diet, and you're suppressing that lowering of T3 that might help you preserve your muscles. What if you are having the symptoms of hypothyroid and you are on a low-carb diet? So you could go through this red herring process of discovering it that your T3 is low and thinking that that's abnormal, even though that's just a feature of ketosis. But with all due respect, I think that what might be going on is something more like this.